Two men stood at the pinnacle of power in Rome, elected by the people, commanders of legions, architects of law, yet bound by tradition, checked by rivals, and entrusted with greatness for only a single year. This was the consulship, the most prestigious and perilous office in the Roman Republic. But what did it truly mean to be consul, and how did this office shape the destiny of an empire? Today, let's walk into the streets of ancient Rome together. Hear the distant clatter of sandals on stone. See the lictors parting the crowd as they carry the fasces, those bundles of rods that whisper both justice and responsibility. The two consuls step forward, not as kings, but as guardians of a promise, that no one man should hold all power in Rome. The story begins after the Romans cast out their last king. They were determined to build something different. Instead of a single ruler, they chose two leaders, elected each year, each able to veto the other. It was a clever solution, a quiet shield against tyranny. One of the first consuls, Lucius Junius Brutus, became a symbol of this new oath. He did not rule through warmth or charisma alone. He placed the republic above family and comfort, reminding everyone that Rome's survival depended on shared rules and shared sacrifice. To be consul was to hold imperium, the authority to command. For 1 year, a consul moved between worlds. On the battlefield, he gave orders that could save a legion or cost it dearly. In the city, he heard legal cases, guided debates, and weighed the balance between mercy and discipline. The fasces told the story clearly. Outside Rome, the axe within the bundle signaled the power to execute. Inside the city, the axe was removed. Even the most powerful had to respect the sacred limits of the city and its laws. That small detail carried a big truth. Freedom survived because power accepted boundaries. Consuls did not work alone. They stood face to face with the Senate, a council of experience and memory that offered advice, urged caution, and sometimes plotted its own path. They also looked to the people who gathered in assemblies beneath the open sky to vote on laws and elect leaders. A consul was always listening to many voices. That was both the burden and the beauty of the job. There were rituals, too, that touched everyday life. Before major decisions, augurs watched the flight of birds, searching the sky for signs. A consul who ignored bad omens risked more than superstition. He risked losing the trust of a city that believed fate spoke through nature. Even the calendar mattered. On certain days, public business paused, and a consul learned patience as much as power. Curiously, the office had practical rules that kept Rome steady. A consul could be fined for leaving office without appointing a successor. The message was simple: Rome must never wake up without leadership. Another little-known detail is that some consuls, when their year ended, were assigned provinces where they continued to command armies as proconsuls. This created both continuity and temptation, because distant power can make home feel far away and oversight feel thin. Of course, human ambition sometimes pressed against these walls. A few men chased repeated consulships, stretching the spirit of the law. Gaius Marius won glory with military reforms that reshaped Rome's legions, but his repeated returns to power stirred unease. Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Rome itself and later published lists of enemies to be punished, a dark moment that left scars on the Republic's memory. Julius Caesar rose as a brilliant general and a skilled politician, and the weight of his fame bent the old rules until they cracked. The consulship survived these storms for a time, but each wave changed its shoreline. Yet not all stories are about conflict. Many consuls quietly kept Rome moving. They repaired roads, negotiated treaties, settled disputes, and celebrated triumphs that honored the soldiers who bled for the city. They supported poets and thinkers, guarded the treasury, and ensured grain reached the hungry. The consulship could be grand, but it was also practical. It was the work of keeping a community stitched together day after day. Rome eventually transformed. When Augustus rose to supreme power after years of civil conflict, the consulship began to lose its edge. It did not disappear. Instead, it became a symbol, a respectful nod to an older tradition. Emperors wore it like a robe that carried memory, even as real authority shifted to the palace. The office, once the heartbeat of the Republic, became a steady drum in the background. Still, the echo of the consulship is not silent. Many modern republics around the world borrow its idea that power should be shared, that leaders should be temporary, and that law should outlast any one person. The lesson is both hopeful and humble. Systems can guide people, but people must choose to honor the system. The consulship worked when its holders believed in something larger than themselves. It faltered when fear or ambition clouded that belief. Imagine the end of a consular year. The lictors lower their fasces. The crowd thins. A consul removes his ring, steps down from the dais, and returns to ordinary life, at least for a time. Another pair of leaders rises to take his place. Rome continues, not because one man holds it together, but because many hands agree to carry it forward. If stories like this spark your curiosity, stay with us. Like this video, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. There are countless lives and choices inside the ancient world, and together we can bring them back to life, one quiet, human moment at a time. Picture this. It's 509 years before Christ, and Rome is in chaos. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, has just been thrown out of the city in disgrace. The Roman people are furious, traumatized by decades of royal tyranny. They've had enough of bowing to one man's whims, enough of watching their daughters violated by princes, enough of seeing their wealth plundered by a corrupt court. But here's the thing about power. It doesn't just disappear. Someone has to lead. Someone has to make the hard decisions, command the armies, and keep the city from falling into anarchy. The Romans faced a fascinating dilemma. How do you govern without a king? How do you maintain order without returning to the very tyranny you just escaped? Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of one ruler, they would have two. Instead of a lifetime appointment, they would serve for just 1 year. Instead of absolute power, they would check each other at every turn. They called these leaders consuls, and this single innovation would shape the course of Western civilization. The Romans weren't just making up rules, they were redesigning the very concept of leadership. Think about it. For the first time in ancient history, a major power was deliberately limiting its own executive authority. It was revolutionary, almost unthinkable in a world where kings ruled by divine right and pharaohs were considered living gods. The genius lay in the details. Each consul could veto the other's decisions with a single word, veto, meaning I forbid. If one consul wanted to declare war and the other disagreed, the matter was dead. If one tried to pass a law that seemed dangerous, his colleague could stop him instantly. It was like having two steering wheels on the same chariot. Awkward sometimes, but nearly impossible to drive off a cliff. And here's where the story gets deeply human. The very first consul was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Yes, an ancestor of the more famous Brutus who would later assassinate Julius Caesar. This Brutus had helped overthrow the monarchy, and now he faced the ultimate test of his principles. His own sons, seduced by promises of power and privilege, began plotting to bring back the exiled king. Imagine the agony of that moment. Here was a father who had just helped create a new form of government based on the idea that no one, not even family, was above the law. When the conspiracy was discovered, Brutus faced a choice that would define not just his legacy, but the entire character of the new republic. He could show mercy to his boys, or he could prove that Roman justice applied to everyone, even his own blood. Brutus chose the republic. He ordered his sons' execution and watched as they were put to death in the Forum. The Roman historian Livy tells us that Brutus never flinched, never turned away, never showed the slightest emotion as his children died for their betrayal. Whether this story is entirely true or partly legend doesn't matter. What matters is that Romans told it for centuries afterward, because it captured something essential about their values. This wasn't just about one man's sacrifice. It was about establishing a principle that would echo through Roman history. The Republic came first, always. Personal feelings, family loyalty, even love itself had to bow before the law and the common good. It was harsh, maybe even cruel by our standards, but it sent a message that reverberated across the ancient world. Rome would not return to the chaos of royal favoritism and arbitrary rule. The consulship became more than just a political office. It became a symbol of Roman virtue, of the idea that power should be earned, limited, and shared. These weren't kings ruling by birthright, but citizens elevated by merit and trusted with the most sacred responsibility in the Republic, keeping Rome free. But the story was just beginning. Over the next 5 centuries, the consulship would evolve, adapt, and ultimately face challenges that would test whether shared power could survive in a world where military genius and personal ambition knew no bounds. Imagine holding absolute power for exactly 365 days. That's what it meant to be a Roman consul, an intoxicating blend of ultimate authority and crushing time pressure. Every morning you'd wake up knowing that you commanded the mightiest military machine in the ancient world, yet also knowing that in just months, you'd return to being an ordinary citizen who could be prosecuted for any mistakes you made. The Romans had a special word for this supreme authority: imperium. It's hard to translate because no modern office quite captures its scope. Imperium meant you could raise armies, declare war, negotiate treaties, and pass judgment on life and death, all with the simple nod of your head. But here's what made it truly extraordinary. This power came with a visual symbol that every Roman recognized instantly. Picture a consul walking through the streets of Rome, and you'll see 12 men marching ahead of him. These are the lictors, his official bodyguards, and each one carries something that would make your blood run cold: the fasces. It looks almost innocent at first glance, just a bundle of wooden rods tied together with red leather straps. But look closer, and you'll see the glint of an axe blade emerging from the bundle. Those rods represented the consul's power to beat and punish. The axe represented something far more final: the power to execute. Every Roman citizen knew what the fasces meant. When a consul approached with his lictors, you were looking at the embodiment of Roman justice and Roman authority walking toward you. But here's where the story gets fascinating, because the Romans built something remarkable into this system, a limitation that revealed their deepest values. When those same consuls walked through the gates of Rome itself, something changed. The lictors would stop, untie the leather straps, and carefully remove the axe from each fasces. Inside the sacred boundary of the city, even the most powerful man in the Republic could not order an execution. This wasn't just ceremony, it was sacred law. Within Rome's walls, Roman citizens had the right to trial, the right to appeal, the right to be heard by their peers. A consul might command legions in Gaul or Spain, might have the power of life and death over foreign enemies, but when he came home, he submitted to the same laws as everyone else. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A consul leading a campaign in distant lands was essentially a military dictator. He could execute deserters, punish rebellious allies, and make split-second decisions that affected thousands of lives. Soldiers followed his orders without question because they knew that hesitation in battle meant death for everyone. Yet the moment that same consul crossed back into Roman territory, his power transformed. He became a civil magistrate, bound by law, accountable to the Senate and the people. It was like switching between 2 completely different jobs every time you traveled. Outside Rome, you were a warrior king. Inside Rome, you were a public servant. This dual nature created some truly remarkable moments in Roman history. Imagine being a foreign ambassador meeting with a consul in his military camp. You'd see him sentencing prisoners, redistributing captured land, essentially acting like an emperor. Then imagine meeting that same man weeks later in the Roman Forum, where he had to politely ask the Senate for permission to hold a triumph and couldn't even order the execution of a common thief without due process. The consuls also wielded enormous influence over Roman law. They didn't just enforce existing rules, they could propose entirely new ones. Every major piece of legislation in the Republic began with a consul standing before the Senate or the popular assembly, arguing his case. Some of Rome's most enduring legal principles started as one man's vision, debated and refined through the Republican process. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of consular power was how it shaped the men who held it. These weren't career politicians in our modern sense. They were expected to be warriors, judges, diplomats, financial managers, and inspiring leaders all at once. A successful consul needed to understand military strategy, legal precedent, economic policy, and international relations. It was like being asked to excel at 4 different careers simultaneously. The pressure was immense. Roman society was utterly unforgiving of failure, especially among its leaders. A consul who lost a major battle might face exile or prosecution when his term ended. One who mismanaged the treasury could find himself bankrupt and disgraced. The stakes were so high that many promising politicians chose never to seek the office, preferring safer positions with less responsibility. Yet for those who succeeded, the rewards were beyond measure. A successful consul became a hero for life. His name would be remembered in the official records, called the Fasti, which listed every consul going back to the founding of the Republic. Romans dated events by consular years. They'd say something happened when Marcus and Gaius were consuls, rather than using numbers. To have a year named after you was the closest thing to immortality the ancient world could offer. The consulship also created a unique rhythm in Roman life. Every January 1st, 2 new leaders took office in elaborate ceremonies. The outgoing consuls would hand over their authority, the new ones would make solemn vows to protect the Republic, and ordinary citizens would watch this peaceful transfer of power with pride. It was democracy in action, centuries before that word was even invented. This annual renewal kept Roman government fresh and responsive. Unlike kingdoms where aging monarchs might cling to power for decades, Rome got new energy and new perspectives every single year. Young consuls brought innovation and ambition. Experienced ones brought wisdom and caution. The combination kept the Republic dynamic and adaptable. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys through the corridors of power that shaped our world. The Roman Republic was built on a beautiful idea, that power shared is power controlled. For centuries, this system worked brilliantly. Consuls served their year, stepped down gracefully, and watched their successors take the stage. But every system has its breaking point, and Rome's came when extraordinary men decided that ordinary rules no longer applied to them. It started subtly, almost innocently. Around 107 years before Christ, a general named Gaius Marius found himself facing a crisis that would change everything. Rome was under attack by fierce Germanic tribes, and the traditional one-year consulship seemed woefully inadequate for such a massive threat. How could anyone plan a multi-year campaign when they'd be out of office before the first battle was won? Marius had already served as consul once, which should have been enough for any Roman's lifetime ambition. But the people were terrified, the Senate was desperate, and Marius was the only general who seemed capable of saving Rome. So they did something unprecedented. They elected him consul again, and then again, and again. By the time the crisis ended, Marius had served as consul 7 times, shattering every tradition the Republic held sacred. Here's what's fascinating about this moment. Marius probably saved Rome. His military reforms created the professional legions that would conquer the known world. His victories secured Roman territory for generations, but he also opened a door that could never be closed again. He proved that the sacred annual limit could be broken when circumstances demanded it. And once that precedent existed, other ambitious men began to wonder what circumstances might demand their own return to power. The next chapter in this story belongs to a man who would make Marius look like a gentle reformer. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was everything the Romans feared in a leader, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He had served as consul in 88 before Christ, but unlike his predecessors, Sulla refused to accept that his authority ended when his term expired. When the Roman government tried to transfer his command to a political rival, Sulla made a decision that shocked the ancient world. He turned his legions around and marched on Rome itself. Think about the magnitude of this moment. For over 400 years, Roman armies had marched outward, toward enemies, toward conquest, toward glory. No Roman general had ever pointed his soldiers toward the city that had given him everything. The sight of Roman legions approaching Rome's gates must have been surreal. Citizens watched in disbelief as their own protectors became their conquerors. Sulla didn't see it that way, of course. In his mind, he was saving the Republic from corrupt politicians who were destroying Roman traditions. He was restoring order, protecting the Constitution, defending the very values that made Rome great. But here's the terrifying thing about Sulla's logic. It made perfect sense to him. He genuinely believed that by breaking the law, he was preserving it. By attacking the Republic, he was saving it. This is how democracy dies, not with evil men plotting in shadows, but with good men convinced they know better than the system that elevated them. Sulla's first march on Rome was just the beginning. After securing his position and completing his military campaigns, he returned to private life, apparently satisfied that he had restored proper order. But the damage was done. The precedent was set. When political conflicts arose again, Sulla marched on Rome a second time, and this time he wasn't interested in temporary solutions. What followed was something the Republic had never seen: systematic political purging disguised as legal process. Sulla created what he called proscription lists, essentially death warrants posted in the forum for all to see. These weren't battlefield executions or emergency punishments. They were carefully planned eliminations of political opponents, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The lists would appear overnight, posted on whiteboards in the most public spaces of Rome. Citizens would gather in the morning to read them with a mixture of curiosity and terror. If your name appeared on a proscription list, you were officially declared an enemy of the state. Anyone could kill you on sight and claim a reward. Your property would be confiscated, your family dishonored, your very existence erased from Roman records. What made this especially chilling was its methodical nature. Sulla wasn't acting in the heat of battle or the chaos of revolution. He had won his civil war. Rome was secure. Yet he continued adding names to the lists, day after day, week after week. Some victims were genuine political enemies. Others were simply wealthy men whose fortunes Sulla needed to fund his reforms. A few were apparently added because someone had a personal grudge and the right connections. The psychological impact on Roman society was devastating. Imagine waking up each day wondering if your name might appear on a death list. Imagine the conversations that stopped when you entered a room, the friends who suddenly avoided you, the constant calculation of whether your words or actions might be misinterpreted as treason. Trust, the foundation of any republic, began to crumble. Yet Sulla always insisted he was saving the Republic, not destroying it. He passed constitutional reforms designed to strengthen the Senate and limit future strongmen. He voluntarily stepped down from power when he felt his work was complete, retiring to his villa to write memoirs and enjoy his gardens. In his own mind, he was a reluctant dictator who had reluctantly accepted extraordinary power to restore extraordinary order. The tragedy was that Sulla's medicine proved more dangerous than the disease he claimed to cure. His example taught ambitious Romans that constitutional limits were suggestions, not laws. His proscription lists showed that political opponents could be eliminated rather than merely defeated. His marches on Rome demonstrated that loyal armies could be turned against the state they served, and watching all of this unfold was a young man named Julius Caesar, whose own name had briefly appeared on Sulla's proscription lists before influential friends secured his pardon. Caesar learned Sulla's lessons well, perhaps too well. He saw how emergency powers could be justified, how constitutional traditions could be bent, how the Republic's own mechanisms could be used to transform it into something entirely different. The consulship that had begun as Rome's safeguard against tyranny was becoming the very vehicle by which ambitious men approached tyranny. The office designed to prevent another king was producing would-be kings instead. The system built on checks and balances was discovering that some men were powerful enough to break the scales entirely. But even as the Republic began to strain under the weight of these unprecedented ambitions, Romans continued to believe in their system. They told themselves that Marius had been necessary, that Sulla had been justified, that the Constitution could survive any crisis if good men respected its spirit. They couldn't yet see that they were living through the end of an era, watching their beloved republic transform into something their founders would barely recognize. The stage was set for the final act of this drama, when the consulship would face its ultimate test in the hands of men who understood both its power and its weaknesses better than anyone who had come before. So here we stand at the end of this remarkable journey, looking back at 5 centuries of Roman innovation that changed the world forever. The consulship wasn't just a political office. It was humanity's first serious attempt to answer one of the most challenging questions in history. How do you organize a society without falling into either chaos or tyranny? For nearly 500 years, the Roman Republic found its answer in this delicate dance between 2 leaders. Every January, 2 men would take an oath to serve Rome above themselves, knowing that by December they'd have to hand over the greatest power on earth to their successors. It worked far longer than anyone had a right to expect. Think about it. Most democracies in human history have lasted decades, not centuries. But every great experiment eventually faces its ultimate test, and Rome's came in the form of Augustus Caesar. Here was a man who understood the system better than anyone who had come before him. He had watched his great-uncle Julius manipulate republican institutions until they broke. He had seen how civil wars erupted when ambitious men ignored constitutional limits. And he came up with a solution that was both brilliant and heartbreaking. Augustus didn't destroy the consulship. That would have been too obvious, too brutal for Roman sensibilities. Instead, he did something far more subtle and permanent. He kept the office exactly as it had always been, complete with all its ceremonies, symbols, and traditions. Romans still elected consuls every year. The fasces still paraded through the streets. The annual rituals continued unchanged. But Augustus made sure that real power flowed through him. Consuls still existed, but they governed only with his permission. They still commanded armies, but only armies he allowed them to command. They still proposed laws, but only laws he wanted proposed. The office that had once represented the pinnacle of Roman achievement became an elaborate performance, a beautiful costume worn by actors on a stage where Augustus held every script. What's remarkable is how willingly Romans accepted this transformation. They were exhausted by decades of civil war, terrified by the chaos that had consumed their parents' generation. Augustus offered them something precious: stability. The price was their republic, but many Romans thought it was a bargain worth making. They could keep their beloved traditions, while someone else handled the messy realities of governing a vast empire. And here's where the story becomes deeply relevant to our modern world. The Roman Republic didn't fall because of foreign invasion or natural disaster. It died because its own success made it ungovernable. The empire became too large, the armies too powerful, the wealth too concentrated, and the ambitions too grand for the simple systems that had worked when Rome was just another Italian city-state. The consulship revealed both the possibilities and the limits of shared power. On one hand, it proved that complex societies could function without kings or dictators. It showed that leadership could be earned rather than inherited, that power could be temporary rather than permanent, that even the mightiest rulers could be held accountable to law and tradition. On the other hand, it demonstrated that institutional safeguards are only as strong as the people who respect them. When men like Marius, Sulla, and Caesar decided that their personal vision mattered more than constitutional limits, the consulship couldn't stop them. Rules written on parchment proved powerless against legions loyal to charismatic commanders. The legacy of the Roman consulship echoes through every modern democracy. When we elect presidents for fixed terms, we're following Rome's example. When we create systems of checks and balances, we're learning from Roman experience. When we worry about the concentration of executive power, we're grappling with the same challenges that kept Roman senators awake at night. But Rome's story also carries a warning that feels urgently relevant today. Republics don't usually die from external conquest. They die from internal contradictions. They collapse when citizens lose faith in shared institutions, when leaders prioritize personal loyalty over constitutional duty, when emergency powers become permanent features rather than temporary necessities. The Romans created something beautiful and fragile, a government based on the radical idea that power should serve the community rather than itself. For centuries, that idea worked because enough people believed in it strongly enough to sacrifice for it. The consulship succeeded as long as ambitious men were willing to accept limits on their ambitions. When that willingness disappeared, when personal glory became more important than public service, the Republic began its slow transformation into something entirely different. The consulship survived in name for centuries under the emperors, but its soul, that essential belief in shared power and mutual restraint, had already died. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the Roman consulship. It's not enough to create good institutions, you need good people to run them. It's not enough to write wise laws. You need citizens who believe those laws matter more than personal advantage. The consulship was brilliant political engineering, but it couldn't engineer the human character. It could channel ambition, but it couldn't cure it. So was the consulship a success or a failure? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the right question is, what made it work for as long as it did, and what can we learn from both its triumphs and its collapse? Because the story of the Roman consulship isn't really about ancient history, it's about the eternal human struggle to balance freedom with order, ambition with restraint, individual greatness with collective good. The Romans tried to solve this puzzle with remarkable creativity and wisdom. They didn't succeed forever, but they succeeded long enough to build one of history's greatest civilizations. And they left us a roadmap, not of guaranteed success, but of noble failure, of the kind of risks worth taking when the stakes are human dignity and freedom itself. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tradition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world, where the past speaks directly to our present and the voices of history help us understand the choices we face today.